Do you remember the first time you watched a Western film? A lone hero rides into town, a gun on his hip, a white hat on his head, ready to deliver justice. That's the image an entire generation grew up with. But what if most of what we believe isn't real? In this video, we'll uncover 20 shocking facts about the Wild West, breaking down the myths created by Hollywood to reveal the real West. Rough, raw, intense, and beautiful in a completely different way. Myth number 1. Every cowboy wore a six-shooter. You've seen this scene 1,000 times. The cowboy walking into a dusty town, coat flapping in the wind, revolver swinging at his side, ready for a showdown. But in reality, the famous six-shooter was more of a Hollywood prop than everyday gear. Most cowboys weren't gunfighters like you see in movies. They were workers. Laborers who herded cattle, fixed fences, mended saddles, and lived outside for weeks at a time. For them, carrying a revolver was impractical. It was heavy, expensive, and not useful for daily chores. Imagine riding for miles, your hands constantly busy, and having to haul around a chunk of metal at your waist, like carrying a brick in your pocket. Some ranches even banned personal firearms entirely, since they could easily lead to fights or accidents. When they needed protection or had to deal with wild animals, they preferred rifles or shotguns, far more effective from a distance. On their belts, you'd more likely find ropes, folding knives or hammers, practical tools for hard-working men on the prairie. But then came Hollywood. Filmmakers needed action, conflict, and dramatic quick-draw scenes to keep audiences entertained. And so, the cowboy became a lone gunman, always ready for a shootout. But the real cowboys, they kept working, with calloused hands, dusty boots, and usually no bullets in the chamber. Myth number 2. All cowboys wore Stetson hats. This image is so common, it's hard to imagine anything else. A man on horseback, wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes. But the truth? Many cowboys never wore Stetsons, and if they did, the hats didn't look like the ones in movies. The original Stetson was called the Boss of the Plains. It had a flat top and round brim, a simple, practical design meant to protect against the sun and dust. In fact, many cowboys wore bowler hats, also known as derbies, Mexican-style sombreros for extra sun coverage, or even repurposed military caps from the Civil War. Hat choice was all about need, price, and comfort, not about looking like a cowboy. But then the stage took over. Wild West shows, especially Buffalo Bills, needed a clear hero image, and the tall, dramatic Stetson quickly became the symbol of the Western cowboy. Dime novels helped spread the myth to millions. Stories printed in cheap, pocket-sized books turned the cowboy into a national legend. These tales reached every corner of America, further cementing the image of the noble, gun-slinging hero, even though most of it was pure fantasy. Myth number 3. Cowboys were always clean-shaven and tidy. If you've only seen cowboys in movies, you'd assume they were always freshly shaved, dressed in spotless white shirts, and had perfectly styled hair, even after riding hundreds of miles across the desert. But that polished image is pure fiction. In reality, personal hygiene on the trail was nearly impossible. There was often no clean water, no time for grooming, and no mirrors in the middle of nowhere. Most of a cowboy's day was spent herding cattle, setting up camp, or keeping watch at night. So, rough beards, dirty clothes, and bodies covered in dust and sweat were completely normal. Many cowboys had thick mustaches, scruffy beards, or whatever nature gave them. Not by choice, but because they simply couldn't bother with shaving. And their clothes? Worn because they were cheap, tough, and easy to patch. Not because they looked good. But in movies, no one wants to see a cowboy who looks like he just rolled out of a sandstorm. Directors, makeup artists, and costume designers created a cleaner, more glamorous version. The rugged but handsome cowboy. While actors had their hair styled and shirts ironed, the real cowboys were sleeping under open skies, using their saddles as pillows and letting their beards grow naturally by the hour. Myth number 4. Cowboys were tall, muscular action heroes. We're used to seeing cowboys portrayed as tall men with broad shoulders and chiseled jaws, like they just walked off a magazine cover. But if you traveled back in time to the late 1800s, you'd likely be surprised. Most real cowboys were short and lean. On average, they stood around 5 feet 5 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed under 150 pounds. That wasn't a flaw. It was practical. Riding long distances, climbing hills, and crossing rivers required stamina and efficiency. A smaller frame was easier on the rider and the horse. These men were often sons of poor farmers, raised on hard work and little food. They didn't grow up lifting weights or flexing muscles. They grew up working. They didn't need biceps. They needed endurance, and they had plenty of it. Myth number 5. Being a cowboy was a romantic adventure. Movies make it seem like being a cowboy was a non-stop thrill ride. Gunfights, wild chases on horseback, whiskey-fueled laughs in saloons, and a beautiful woman waiting on the balcony at the end of the day. But in truth, there was very little glamour. Cowboy life was tough, repetitive, and exhausting. Work started before sunrise. They'd ride for miles under the blazing sun or in freezing rain, through dry plains or muddy terrain. They faced dust storms, rattlesnakes, and aching muscles. At sunset, they'd set up camp, cook a simple meal, usually just beans and cornbread, and then take turns standing guard over the cattle through the night. They'd sleep on the ground, wake up sore, and do it all over again. The dangers were real, but not like in the movies. A charging bull, a spooked horse, or a hidden snake posed more risk than any outlaw. And the pay? Often less than $1 a day. Just enough for food, tobacco, and maybe a new pair of gloves. Hollywood ignored all that, of course. Because if they showed the real life of a cowboy, most viewers would walk out after 10 minutes. Instead, Hollywood gave us thrilling gunfights, dramatic love stories, and the image of a lone man riding into the sunset. It was a beautiful dream, but very far from the truth. Do you remember the first Western film you ever watched? Share it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your memories. Myth number 6. Cowboys always had a loyal horse by their side. In classic Western films, cowboys are always shown with a trusted horse. Sleek, fast, and seemingly always nearby, like a loyal best friend. There's often this sense of a deep, almost spiritual bond between man and animal. But in reality, it wasn't that romantic. Most cowboys didn't own their horses. The horses belonged to the ranch. Cowboys were assigned one or more animals to use during cattle drives. When the day's work ended, the horse was returned to the corral, just like any other piece of equipment. No emotional farewells, no riding off into the sunset, just loosening the reins, walking the horse back, and heading off for a bowl of beans. Horses were chosen not for beauty, but for their stamina, sure footing, and ability to handle rough terrain. They were usually smaller than the ones seen in movies, but far better suited to crossing rocky hills, thorny brush, and endless dry plains. A good horse wasn't flashy. It was smart, knowing when to stop, when to pivot from a charging steer, and when to stay calm in the chaos of a stampede. Myth number 7. The Wild West was populated only by white men. If you relied only on movies, you'd think the Old West was entirely made up of white cowboys, sheriffs, and bandits. But that version of history leaves out a lot. In truth, the American West in the 1800s was surprisingly diverse. About 1 in 4 cowboys were black, many of them formerly enslaved men who had found freedom after the Civil War. They worked alongside Mexican vaqueros, who had been herding cattle long before cowboy became a common word. From them, we got terms like lasso, rodeo, and chaps, all central to cowboy culture today. Native American tribes still lived across the West, with some working as scouts or guides. Chinese immigrants helped build the railroads and worked in mining towns. and European settlers arrived chasing dreams of land and freedom. Yet in hundreds of Western films, these groups were left out, erased from the story. Why? Because the early storytellers, from dime novel writers to Hollywood producers, chose to tell the story from one point of view. One that was easier to write, easier to film, and easier to sell to white audiences at the time. But the real history? It wasn't so black and white. It was far more colorful and far more interesting. Myth number 8. Women were just background characters in the West. In most Western films, women are little more than scenery, standing behind the saloon bar or peeking out from upstairs windows. Their roles were often limited to screaming, fainting, or crying, while the men took center stage. But real women in the West were much more than bystanders. Nearly a third of land applications under the U.S. Homestead Act were filed by women, many of them single, widowed, or mothers looking to start fresh. These women ran farms, opened businesses, worked as teachers, midwives, and even mail carriers. One of them, Mary Fields, also known as Stagecoach Mary, was a black woman who delivered mail through snow-covered mountains and was known for being fearless, skilled with a gun, and tougher than most men. Some women even disguised themselves as men to earn a living in male-only jobs. Charlotte Parkhurst drove stagecoaches and voted in an election, decades before women officially won the right to vote. Others, like Annie Oakley and Calamity Jane, became legends, known for their sharpshooting skills, independence, and refusal to live by society's rules. But these women weren't exceptions. They were part of a larger wave of pioneers who truly helped build the West. Myth number 9, Native Americans were bloodthirsty savages. One of the most damaging myths cinema ever planted is the image of wild, bloodthirsty Native Americans lurking to kill white settlers. Though some modern films have tried to fix this, the old prejudice runs deep. The truth? Native societies were incredibly diverse. Hundreds of tribes, each with their own languages, cultures, and ways of life. They weren't a single group, but many different peoples. When conflicts happened, they were usually about defending land, broken treaties, or trying to protect their communities from displacement or worse. Not some mindless, violent instinct. Even the word Indian is a mistake, coming from Columbus's false belief he had reached India. Yet Hollywood kept using this wrong label for centuries, oversimplifying and misrepresenting these rich cultures. Myth number 10, Western towns were lawless and violent. Movies make it seem like every town was a powder keg ready to explode. One wrong look, one bad word, and a shootout breaks out. But in reality, most settlers wanted peace and order. Towns were built for living, raising families, and trading, not for gunfights. Many had sheriffs, courts, laws, and even curfews. Some towns required visitors to check their weapons at the gate. Sure, there were boom towns around gold mines and railroads where lawlessness was common. But those were the exception, not the rule. Where formal government was weak or absent, residents often formed committees or vigilante groups to keep peace and stability. Hollywood chose wild, chaotic towns because they made better stories. Gunfights and drama sell tickets. But the truth is, hundreds of peaceful towns flourished, where people tended gardens, built schools, and opened churches. Quick question, which do you prefer? The glamorous Hollywood version or the rough but real story? Comment just one word, movie or real. Myth number 11, Western sheriffs were corrupt or cowardly. Many cowboy films start with a corrupt sheriff hiding while thugs run the town, a stereotype so common that viewers expect sheriffs to be weak shadows needing a hero. But in real life, sheriffs were often the town's last line of defense. Their job was tough, managing disputes, stopping fights, enforcing the law among strangers fueled by alcohol, gambling, and land feuds. They kept peace between rival groups, resolved property conflicts, and faced real dangers, often alone. Of course, some sheriffs were crooked or under the thumb of local powers, But most were hard-working, dedicated people, not movie heroes with perfect aim or stirring speeches. They showed up when... Myth number 12, vigilante justice was always righteous and necessary. Western films often glorify vigilante groups, angry citizens who take the law into their own hands when official justice fails. They ride at night, torches blazing, fueled by a sense of justice, becoming symbols of order in a lawless land. But under the surface, things were more complicated. In new territories without courts or police, vigilante groups sometimes formed to protect communities, initially with good intentions. But without oversight, power was easily abused. Quick trials, hangings without fair hearings, and revenge disguised as justice happened all too often. A famous example is the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance in 1856, a group of over 6,000 members who carried out dozens of hangings without court trials. They didn't enforce the law. They replaced it. And that's a very dangerous line to cross. Myth number 13, bounty hunting was a heroic, glamorous job. In movies, bounty hunting scenes are full of heroic music and dramatic lighting. But in real life, it was far from glamorous. A quick, rash decision could end the life of an innocent person. Without fair legal process, bounty hunting often became a way to settle personal grudges instead of maintaining order. If you lived in a Wild West town, what would you prefer? A slow, fair legal system, or quick justice handed out by whoever had the bigger gun? Myth number 14. High noon gunfights happened all the time. The famous showdown, two men in the street, hands hovering over guns, the clock striking noon, the town holding its breath, is a classic Western movie scene. We almost believe these duels happened every week. But in reality, such one-on-one gunfights were as rare as snow in Texas during summer. Most gun violence was fueled by alcohol, gambling, and sudden tempers, not carefully planned duels. Fights often broke out in saloons or over card games, with guns drawn suddenly. But no one stood calmly waiting to be shot. People ducked behind barrels, bars, or anything nearby. Also, the term gunslinger wasn't used at the time. It was invented later by writers and filmmakers to give a cool name to their heroes. Those who really knew how to use guns used them for survival, not for show. Famous shootouts like the one at the OK Corral were quick, chaotic, and terrifying, lasting just seconds and ending in blood and confusion. Myth number 15. Saloon brawls were huge, epic battles. In movies, saloons are full of piano music and laughter, until suddenly a massive fight breaks out. Chairs fly, bottles smash, people tumble through windows. But if you owned a saloon back then, a big brawl was a nightmare. Sure, small fights happened, especially after too much alcohol and gambling losses. But long, destructive brawls were rare. Saloon owners had good reasons to stop trouble. Damaged furniture cost money, rowdy customers scared others away, and fights sometimes led to deaths. Bad for business. Many saloons had strict rules, no guns, no fighting, and bouncers to keep order. Most customers just wanted a drink, some cards, and a good night's rest. Myth number 16. The gunfight at the OK Corral happened inside the corral. Many people think the famous shootout between Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the Clanton gang happened inside the livestock enclosure, called the OK Corral. But actually, the gunfight took place in a narrow vacant lot, next to a photography studio, about half a block away from the corral. On October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona, the shootout lasted less than 30 seconds, leaving 3 dead and several wounded. There was no dramatic quick draw or crowd watching. It was chaotic, confusing, and over almost before anyone realized it started. So why is it called the gunfight at the OK Corral? Because the name sounds cooler. When newspapers and novels sensationalized the event, they picked a catchy title. The empty lot next to the photo studio wasn't as exciting a name as OK Corral. Over time, the truth was buried by myth, a perfect example of how Hollywood and the media turn real events into legends, just by choosing the right cowboy-sounding name. Myth number 17. Old-time revolvers were as accurate and powerful as movies show. If you've seen scenes where a cowboy shoots a gun out of an enemy's hand from dozens of yards away, you might think those classic revolvers were incredibly accurate and deadly. But the truth is, shooters back then weren't that precise or powerful. Revolvers of the era were far from the reliable, precise weapons cinema makes them out to be. They used black powder, firing heavy lead bullets at low speeds. When fired, a thick white cloud of smoke puffed out, often blocking the shooter's view of the target. At distances beyond 50 feet, hitting a small target was mostly luck, not skill. Guns frequently jammed, got dirty, and if not carefully maintained, could even injure their users. Those who needed real self-defense, like sheriffs or night watchmen, usually preferred rifles or shotguns, easier to aim, longer range, and with more stopping power against wild animals or attackers. Revolvers were secondary tools, especially when guarding cattle out in the open. Fancy trick shots, like hitting coins or breaking bottles from a distance, were usually just performance tricks or movie magic. Lead bullets didn't ricochet dramatically like in films. They typically shattered or flattened on impact. But these glamorous images stuck in people's minds because they made heroes look cooler and the Wild West more exciting. Myth number 18. Train robberies were common in the Wild West. Nothing says cowboy like a gang of bandits riding alongside a moving train, jumping onto the roof, and holding up the engineer with a black revolver. From the 1903 silent film, The Great Train Robbery, to countless movies since, this image became so popular that everyone believed train robbery was a core part of the West. However, the reality is surprising. Over the 40 golden years of the West, fewer than 1,000 train robberies were recorded, about 20 to 25 per year, and not all took place west of the Mississippi. Many were inside jobs or petty theft. Some big attempts failed spectacularly. There were no dramatic horse-to-train jumps or explosive safe-cracking like in the movies. Bank robberies were even rarer. The most common crimes were cattle rustling, land fraud, and alcohol-fueled violence, none of which made for exciting film plots. It was the Great Train Robbery that planted the powerful legend of trains, masks, and guns in the public imagination, even though reality was much less dramatic. Myth number 19. Horses were the only way to get around in the West. In popular memory, the West was all hoofbeats. Every hero and villain rode a horse, as if the vast land had no other transportation. But history tells a richer story. Horses were essential, but not the only option. Before railroads, stagecoaches ran across the West, connecting towns and carrying mail, passengers, and sometimes valuables like gold and silver. These were the first public transit routes in the Wild Territory. By the 1870s, railroads spread widely. The Transcontinental Railroad linked the East and West Coasts, delivering people and goods to places horses once took weeks to reach. Towns grew along the tracks, and trains became a symbol of progress. Yet despite these changes, the image of the lone rider stayed strong in popular culture. Why? Because one person on a horse, riding freely across open land, is a much more romantic symbol than crowded trains or bumpy stagecoaches. Myth number 20. Anyone who dug for gold would get rich. We've all heard countless stories about hopeful prospectors who left everything behind, rushed west, and struck it rich by finding a nugget as big as a potato on their very first swing. But the reality was very different. The gold rush was often a long, exhausting journey full of mud, disappointment, and backbreaking work. When the California gold rush began in 1848, it's true a few lucky people got rich quickly. But as thousands poured in, the easily accessible gold spots were claimed almost immediately. Most miners had to sift through tons of dirt and sand just to collect tiny flakes of gold dust. Many barely made enough money to pay for their tools, shovels, pickaxes, and pans. So, who really got rich? It was the people who sold the tools, food, and drink, the small store owners, saloon keepers, and lodging house operators who sprang up around mining camps. They were the ones who walked away with pockets full of cash. Did you ever believe the instant gold stories when you were a kid? Let me know in the comments. I bet you're not alone. And that's a wrap on these Wild West myths, busting legends and revealing the real stories behind the Hollywood shine. The truth is often more interesting, tougher, and far less glamorous than what the movies show us. Which myth surprised you the most? Or did any of these change the way you imagine the Old West? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm excited to hear your take. Thanks for sticking around to uncover the real Wild West with me. If you enjoyed busting these myths and learning the truth behind the legends, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more fascinating stories.